All right. So it's 9 o'clock Central Time. I think it's 7 a.m. for our California participants and 4 p.m. for those of us joining from Scandinavia. Thank you, all of you, for being here. My name is Kelly McKowen. I'll say at the outset, this is Welfare. This is the first event for New Nordic Anthropology, a digital roundtable series. We have 3 other events. I've been circulating the information about those, so keep an eye out for more information. We're going to do one of them each month. So I'm Kelly McKowen. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University, and I am a co-organizer of the series along with Stockholm University's Helena Wolf and the University of Oslo's Thomas Hilland Eriksson, both of whom I see here. So we're very glad to have all of you. Before I introduce the panel for today's roundtable, I just wanted to thank our audience. Like I said, I was very pleased to see that this seemed to resonate with a kind of broad group of people, spanning the Atlantic. So it's really heartening as an academic to discover that there are people out there that share your interests. And I think in this case, also a feeling, because the inspiration for this roundtable series really came from a shared feeling that the anthropologies of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden have effloresced in the past decade or so with new concerns, new objects of inquiry, new field sites, new theoretical lenses and methodological tools, and really importantly, new voices. I think when viewed against the most well-known English language synopsis of the regional scholarship, Marianne Gullestad's 1989 annual review article, Small Facts and Large Issues, there's an inescapable feeling, at least that I have, that the anthropology of the Nordics feels new. It feels different, and I think wonderfully so. So the series in general aims to curate dialogues about the state of the field among scholars doing innovative work from different countries and at different stages of their careers. The conversations revolve around keywords, but are open-ended and participatory. And I'll say, this was less about bringing together scholars that, work on welfare and more about finding a word that brings together the scholars that we want to be talking with. It was really, the word was an excuse to bring people together. So these discussions aim to track trends. We want to uncover our shared questions and interests and sketch agendas. It's really about seeing what comes out of putting these fantastic scholars in the same digital room. So this is one of these incredible things that Zoom's actually enabled us to do. So I'll be moderating and participating in today's roundtable. It'll consist of an approximately 60-minute conversation. So we'll go till 10 a.m. my time, whatever an hour from now is for you. Conversation among the panelists, and the remaining time, the remaining half an hour approximately, will be for open discussion that incorporates any questions and insights that our audience has. When that time comes, I ask that if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, please use the raised hand function, especially because I think that there is enough of you. I won't be able to see you if you just raise your actual hand. So use the Zoom function there, and I'll call on you in the order that I see you. Throughout, if you are in the audience, please do us all a big favor and make sure you are muted. With that, I'm going to introduce our panel. So we're fortunate to be joined today by 4 brilliant, luminous scholars of the contemporary Nordics. First, we have Daena Funahashi. Daena joins us from the University of California, Berkeley. She's a recent transplant, as she just pointed out, from Denmark, where she's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. You may know Daena from her work on health and health politics in Thailand, or more likely and more relevantly for our purposes, for her scholarship on labor, burnout, and governance in Finland. Daena is the author of a fantastic 2013 cultural anthropology article, Wrapped in Plastic, Transformation and Alienation in the New Finnish Economy. And I believe, if her faculty pages is up to date, she's currently working on a book project tentatively titled Untimely Sacrifices, Work and Death in Finland. We look forward to seeing it in print. So welcome to Daena. We're no less fortunate to be joined by Keith M. Murphy, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Keith's a linguistic and sociocultural anthropologist whose interests span design, graphic language, architecture, embodiment, and phenomenology, both in Sweden and the United States. In 2015, Keith gifted the field his wonderful monograph, Swedish Design and Ethnography, which considers design as a medium for the articulation of a politics that's supposedly, if not social democratic, that's seemingly congruent with its distinctive ethos. In this, as well as a 2013 American Ethnology article, A Cultural Geometry, Keith illuminates or perhaps interrogates the notion that formal characteristics of design are a means of articulating values, ideas, and commitments. So welcome, Keith. Moving from California now to Sweden. This is kind of interesting that we have the Californians and our Scandinavians here. We have Renita Thedvall. an associate professor who joins us from the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University. Renita is a leading authority on the anthropology of meetings, public sector administration and reform, and the building blocks of contemporary policy worlds, so indicators, models, standards, and so on. She's written extensively on the reimagining of administration in Sweden's public preschools, and with Christina Garston and Jessica Lindberg, she co-edited one of my favorite recent volumes, 2015's Makeshift Work in a Changing Labor Market, the Swedish Model in the Post-Financial Crisis Era. And I've really seen nothing like that in terms of what, the concerns that it speaks to. So welcome, Renita. And finally, we're fortunate to be joined by Halvard Vike, professor in the Department of Health, Social, and Welfare Studies at the University of Southeastern Norway. Halvard is an expert on state formation, social equality, and the contemporary Norwegian welfare state, one of, I think, the leading experts on those things. Halvard's scholarship is fundamental to what I think you could call the anthropology of the welfare state. And in particular, I'm very much partial to his theoretical work on the institutionalization of autonomy and bureaucratic individualism. I'll probably try to get him to talk about it. In Scandinavian state, which to my knowledge has only appeared in Norwegian, much to the detriment of the English, the non-Norwegian reading audience. So I hope Halvard will see that in translation at some point. I think it's essential reading. His recent works included 2018 monograph, Politics and Bureaucracy in the Norwegian Welfare State, and a co-edited 2018 volume, Egalitarianism in Scandinavia. So welcome, Halvard. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I want to begin the conversation by actually returning to a piece that I've already referenced. And this is, I'm going to kind of present this to all of you, so please feel free to respond if the spirit moves you. I want to return to Mariana Gulestad's 1989 review of Scandinavian anthropology. In that article, she grasped for defining features of a Scandinavian culture area, writing that, quote, just as colonialism provided one kind of context for anthropological studies, the anthropology of modern Scandinavia can be examined in relation to its welfare states. I want to ask you all, what do you think she meant by that? Do you agree? Is it still relevant? And to what extent might welfare or the welfare state anchor interregional comparison and conversation?
So maybe if no one else wants to start,
please.
Maybe I can begin. I think it's certainly still a key word or relevant for anthropology of the Nordics. Welfare is incremental to understand the anthropology or to understand the Nordic countries. So it's certainly still important. Possibly changed a bit, but welfare is definitely important. And I think perhaps it's the Swedish word for welfare is välfärd, which is a much broader concept than the notion of welfare, caring for citizens in a much broader sense than the notion of welfare, the English word. So,
what exactly, Renita? Could you think you could specify? I mean, what is the kind of narrow conception do you think that we typically circulate in English, and what are the specific aspects of this broader Swedish definition that you have in mind?
Well, the English one is, as far as I understand it, more about making sure that people have the basic need of food or shelter. But in the Swedish context, välfärd is more, it's sort of caring for citizens in a much broader sense. It's making possible for people to stay in home, taking care of the children. Parental leave is one of these sort of government issued policies, but also infrastructure, making sure that you can buy an environmentally sustainable car because of state giving subsidizes for this. So it's sort of the good life, so to speak, in Swedish terms. That it's välfärd it's a key word definitely for the anthropology of the Nordics.
Absolutely. And Keith, I mean, I think that you probably agree that there's a more expansive when we talk about welfare in the Scandinavian context or even the welfare state, we tend to identify it primarily with policy, but you'd probably argue that it goes very much beyond policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I wrote, when you sent us some questions ahead of time, and I sort of jotted down some notes, and then with this one, I didn't jot down notes because I wasn't sure how I felt about it, honestly. So yeah, I mean, I think in general, a lot of what my work ended up being was sort of finding welfare in the places that aren't necessarily the sort of like the kind that Renita was talking about in terms of the way that we think about it as the provision of particular kinds of welfare. But actually, like, as she said, it's a much broader, more distributed, widely distributed kind of concept in Sweden, certainly. Before I proceed, I just want to say, Renita, Ulf, Helena are like instrumental in me doing everything that I did. So I'm very glad to see you guys and to be on this call with you, because 15 years ago, when I was just a lowly graduate student trying to figure out like learn Swedish and figure out Sweden, like all of you were very instrumental in me like feeling comfortable and doing my work. So thank you so much. But to the point about the culture area, in 2004 or 3 or 4, when I started doing research in Sweden, as an American anthropologist who could only work in English at the time, there's very little stuff on Sweden in anthropology. There was stuff, but not much. And Gulestad's work on sort of either on Norway or on a pan-Scandinavian anthropology was really one of the only sources that I had or that was easily accessible to me. And I can't tell how much of my going into Sweden was shaped by her formulation in this way, so that by the time I got to Sweden, I was thinking about welfare in this particular way. I was thinking about institutions in this way. But then all of the literature that I was able to read, either that came out later or that was in Swedish from other perspectives, once I was able to read Swedish, continued with the same theme, right? So there's an element, and I don't know if other American anthropologists or other non-Scandinavian, non-Nordic anthropologists feel this way, but there's an element in some ways with welfare that's extremely comparative, in the sense that like my experience with welfare from an American context is so impoverished and very specifically political, that when you get to the Scandinavian context, it's just sort of like, wow, this is like culture, right? Like in a way, right? Like to use an old word, right? That I don't know, I've never known whether that's justified or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my own work, I think about there is this kind of narcissism of minor differences in some way, and that I think there are a great deal of, there's more similarity than I think that many people recognize when it comes to comparing, for example, if you're coming from the United States to these Nordic countries. At the same time, there are a number of what we could call conceptual false friends. I mean, we both use the word welfare, but I think we mean different things. In my own work, we both use the word, we use words for unemployment, and I think oftentimes we mean very different things. Go ahead, Daena.
Hi, I might be echoing some of the spirit of the conversation that you guys have been having here, but it's interesting to me that in the question itself, you kind of move from talking about modern Scandinavia to then talking about welfare as a feature of Nordic countries. So then we can't really think about that category, Norden, without going back to the Cold War and why the Nordic Council was established in the first place. So if we think about it from that kind of geopolitical history, there is a definite character to Norden, and that is kind of greater than Scandinavia as a cultural area. And we might even consider comparing that kind of spirit to the welfare programs in Germany, for instance, where people do also talk about vital politik. So kind of piggybacking off of what Keith said about welfare being more than what is explicitly institutionalized, there is that kind of a moral, almost religious, secularized religious feeling to how welfare states legitimize their redistributive mechanisms. That is, I think, is an essential feature.
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, I think your point is well taken. And I think that one of the phrases that really needs to be troubled in Gulestad's assertion is even the idea of culture area and the extent to which we're kind of, reproducing a very narrow understanding of, drawing borders, for example, around a particular region that are perhaps drawn a little bit too clearly and not being open to the kind of porousness of the region. I think that's certainly what we don't want to reproduce a kind of a centralized understanding of, Scandinavia or Norden as a culture area, and then, have our kind of menu of familiar questions. I think part of what we want to do is kind of break open the area and not, go beyond welfare as it's conceived of in traditional terms. I mean, I think all of you do that in your work really wonderfully. So, we want to certainly, my personal stance on this is, I think that one of the, the comparison with colonialism is very interesting because colonialism was kind of a dominating, unmissable part of the context of early anthropological studies, and yet it was missed. I mean, there is this great, to a great extent, it is bracketed in a way that still, I think, makes many anthropologists very uncomfortable. And so, part of me is wondering if what exactly Marianne Gulestad was getting at with seeing it as a contextual factor. Was it something that was supposed to kind of remain in the background and just inform analyses? Was it ever supposed to become its own object of inquiry? Halvard, it's certainly become an object of inquiry in your work. You very much centered the welfare state. So I'd be curious to hear what you think. I mean, is this the defining feature? Should it, of the kind of this culture area? Should we be even thinking in terms of a culture area here?
And to some extent, I think it makes sense, but only partly so. For instance, when we talk about European or Western welfare states, or European Western states in particular, there are some reasons to emphasize the uniqueness of the Scandinavian versions in some post-war period, and before that, possibly and most probably. However, things are changing, and so it's very difficult to insist that, for instance, there are a general uniqueness to the Scandinavian region insofar as they are particular kinds of welfare states today. Perhaps there are it's more reasonable perhaps to talk about deep similarities between the Netherlands and Denmark and Norway. I don't know, but there are at least deep changes, and there are also interesting questions to be asked as to what does the very deep changes that occur in both Sweden and Danish welfare states, I guess, but particularly Sweden in terms of privatization, and Finland, I guess. What does that mean in terms of how we classify political cultures or welfare states? It's difficult, but we need a multidimensional frame of analysis to understand those questions. So for some purposes, it may be useful to think about Norden or Scandinavia as a cultural region. Certainly, that makes sense in some kinds of historical trajectories in terms of the emergence of the welfare state, for instance. That makes a lot of sense to realize the perhaps very underestimated difference between the truly and dominant conservative liberalist origins of the welfare state, but Scandinavia was in some major ways very different because it was inspired much more by an egalitarian spirit, reflecting a different kind of political, not culture, but much more a different set of political alliances that had much more powerful popular movements, for instance. And in that sense, I like to think that in terms of understanding the changes in modern states today, the question is not so much whether or not Scandinavia is so different or unique or still a real welfare state, but they are good to think with in terms of if we look at these states, we may see the lost examples of humankind's experimentation with that kind of state. Maybe it's the kind of a survival, disappearing world phenomenon.
I think there's something to that. I mean, if anyone knows the work of the economists Samuel Bowles and Herb Gintis, I mean, they've written about the modern welfare state as the greatest experiment in, in redistribution among a kind of vast public that, most of whom is never going to actually know one another. And I think it's very tempting to see the Scandinavian societies as the kind of purest example of that, an example that seems to be rapidly disappearing. And this leads to my next question, which is, so Gulestad she writes that piece in 1989, it comes out in 89. In 1990, we get this landmark comparative welfare study, Josta Esping Anderson's The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, which I think if we haven't read closely, we're probably at least aware of. And in that book, Esping Anderson, he gives us this topology that still very much remains with us of the conservative, the liberal, and the social democratic welfare states or welfare regimes. My question for the group is, do we study social democratic societies? Do we study post-social democratic societies? Do we study neoliberal societies? What do you think? Is social democracy something that's still with us and living, or has it become something else? Have we moved to a kind of new Nordic society? What do you all think? Maybe I'll call someone out here because I think that her work speaks to this. Daena, in your work on burnout in Finland, I mean, you talk about new state interventions, I think that very much kind of reflect a neoliberal understanding of the self as entrepreneur. So where would you stand on this? Is this still social democracy? Is this social democracy adapting to something new, or is, like I said, have we moved into something else entirely?
I kind of like what you said about the dangers of sticking to these categorizations, but I see where you're going with this question, so I will follow in your example. But can we still talk about social democracy? Yes, we can. And I think that is because, based on everything that we have talked about, it's not one or the other thing. It's this whole mesh of different affective experiences that are in tune with the specific policies, right? So just because certain economic and political projects have changed, it doesn't mean that the whole social apparatus or the moral codes that are encouraged by it have changed as well. But in answer to your question, maybe answering it more directly, yeah, I do see a huge difference in the way that the welfare state puts in disciplinary techniques, because we all know that the welfare state is not just a political or an economic engine, it's also very technical in the way that it implements its projects to bring that collective feeling together, the thing that conjures that affective bond, that feeling of, owing the nation something, your blood, your labor, your time. So all those things are now mobilized in very different ways. So we now have what Byung-Chul Hun, this philosopher working out of, I think, Berlin, talks about psychopolitics. We have now moved beyond just the disciplining of the physical to talking about, almost turning the subject inside out. You're no longer just accountable for how well you can perform. You must also be able to project your psychological well-being. Happiness is now found to be very lucrative, for instance. So you have to be able to maintain your psychological well-being. You have to be able to meditate. Meditation and feeling good has become a big deal in meetings among CEOs in Davos, for instance. So there are huge changes in terms of how state institutions try to manipulate people at a very subjective level. So yeah, this question is really important in terms of thinking about the relationship between the collective and individual interface in contemporary capitalistic societies.
Absolutely. I think that I'm glad you mentioned meditation. Something that I encountered in my own work studying the unemployed in Norway was they're being forced to practice mindfulness in job seeker courses. And in one kind of absurd incident, a group had been asked to meditate on raisins, I guess to make them better at writing their CVs or something like that. So there's a colonization of the mind certainly taking place. Other thoughts on continuities or discontinuities with social democracy, what it's becoming, if it's been abandoned as a project.
I agree with Daena that it's still social democratic, but it's layered with all sorts of different ideas, and neoliberalism is of course one of those ideas that have entered into the Swedish context as well, but or the Nordic context, but has its own specificities in this context. So it's at least in the Swedish case, it's the idea of the market as being solving problems in the public sector, and the market as the solution is certainly there. But it's so. For example, if we used to have public preschools before, now we have public and private preschools. But still, it's sort of like the Swedish way of doing it is to still pay it with taxes. So even if it's a private preschool, it's paid by taxes. So the parents make a choice of which preschool they want to bring their children to, but it's still a very subsidized fee by the state to send your kids to a preschool. So it's a kind of a sort of a Swedish version of a neoliberalism, and I suppose that I don't know exactly how it is in Norway and Denmark and Finland, but I imagine there are some similarities there. So.
Well, Renita, I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about your work is, I mean, you in the beginning, you talked about the different conceptions of welfare that circulate in English and in Swedish, for example. And there is this tendency to think about welfare in terms of outcomes. But in your work, I mean, you draw our attention to the fact that a lot of it's about processes. I mean, a social democratic understanding of welfare is very much entwined with a particular way of how it's delivered. I mean, could you say a little bit about, I mean, the importing of lean, for example, as a mode of management? I mean, is this reflective of a kind of neoliberal turn in Sweden?
Yeah, it's part of the new public management idea, which is of course connected to neoliberalism. The idea that you can bring private management ideas into the public sector, and one consequence of that is that which was my book, Fast Childcare, is about this importing of the management model lean from the car industry into Swedish public preschools. So as you can imagine, it's a very different context. And as many of these models, management models, when they try to incorporate them into the public sector, they often fail. And this one failed as well, which I'm happy it did. But there's a lot of work, or there's a lot of time and energy going into trying to understand these management models in the public sector. And they try to understand them for like 5 years as the lean model. They were trying to understand it and trying to incorporate it, but they never weren't able. But there's a lot of energy going into this. So yeah.
Absolutely. And it's hard not to see these things as representing discontinuity, but then, I always think of is Torbjørn Jagland, the Prime Minister of Norway in the 1990s, who I think, cheered, deregulation and new public management as the ways to save social democracy. That these weren't breaking with the old ways. These were the antidote to a number of problems that had popped up in the late 1970s and 1980s. Halvard, I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. I mean, as a kind of someone that studies the Norwegian welfare state in various ways. I mean, is this still a social democratic project?
Well, I agree with most of the rest of you, both yes and no. In some ways, there are, in my view, some genuinely social democratic aspects of these societies. And one thing that I would emphasize in particular is the idea of universalism in social policy. and the idea that services are not supposed to be conditional, but universal and easily accessible, and so they're not conditional in the same sense that that in most other welfare states. And that's, I think, the implications of Scandinavian universalism have been underestimated. And I think one of the aspects of this is that over time, universalism has emergent properties, in the sense that universalism it seems to me, to reproduce some of the basic political alliances and shared interests in the populations of Scandinavia that actually challenge some, well, the centralization of the state, for instance. So that, I think that's an interesting aspect. In other ways, the development is the opposite, and it's maybe a paradox that in some ways, like for instance, the Jagland example in Norway may illustrate. The Social Democrats have been very eager to deconstruct the welfare state in many ways in order to allegedly save it. And that has been a mixed process. But there are interesting examples indicating that in some ways, the deinstitutionalization of social democracy happens very fast in some areas. In some ways, for instance, the privatization of public services is one aspect. Another interesting aspect is the labor market. It seems to me that the neoliberalization of some aspects of the labor market is incredibly drastic, and one ironic effect of the very efficient cooperation between the unions and the employers in Norway, for instance, is that the building industry is rapidly changing from a very social democratic, secure job system to something incredibly different in a very short time. The whole logic of the industry is changing, and so are the rights of the workers.
Totally. I mean, I think that the changes themselves are undeniable. And I think that many of you point them out in your work. Some of you've pointed out some of them today in this discussion. I guess the question is what their significance really is, and to what extent, a lot of I'm regularly struck by the amenability, if I can put it that way, of what I would perceive to be social democratic institutions to these kinds of reforms, that suggest to me that there was kind of, there's always been this logic of reemployment and finding new ways to intervene in people's lives, Daena, in people's minds and psychologies, in order to cycle them back into the labor market, to maintain these competitive liberal market, export-oriented economies. So I like I said, I'm routinely struck by the fact that there does seem to be this really, even though they could be at odds, and there are folks that kind of draw the lines very clearly where between where social democracy ends and neoliberalism begins. I think that there are these implications that we find throughout society and at different levels that we have to take seriously. Keith, I'd be interested to hear your perspective, because unlike the rest of the group, you study a kind of medium or a language for the social democratic project that's a little bit different. And I read your work as being kind of skeptical of even the idea that design is a means for articulating these values. I mean, do you see changes in the world of design that reflect kind of some of the other things that Halvard, Renita, and Daena have talked about?
Yes and no. I agree with everything that's been said before. I mean, I think, things have, like that original bout of fieldwork was 15 years ago, and things have changed pretty drastically in those 15 years in Sweden. And I think that was kind of interesting, and I don't know the degree to which Sweden is, stands out in this way, but there, even then, talking to people about social democracy, the welfare state, whatever, the model of the imagined model of the folkhem as like, there was a high point with the folkhem as as like that social democracy and everything else is a version of social democracy that could be better or worse. That having this touchstone shaped a lot of, at least the way that people would talk about it. Whereas, you know, and I had this experience where I landed in Sweden at a particular time, and then I did my field work. And then the conservatives came to power right after I left, literally right after I left, and sort of privatized a bunch of literally like things. I was like, museums are free to get into in Sweden. And then they're like, no, they're not anymore. Right. And so like little things like that actually kind of impacted the way that I was describing things. And then by the time the book came out, it went back. But I had to realize that like actually the neoliberalizing process had been going on since at least the 90s, right? Like this isn't specifically about which party happens to be. I mean, it is, but it's not particularly about what party happens to be in power, which led me to think that like, in some ways, social democracy there isn't a touchstone. It's just an always ongoing process that's undergoing all sorts of change that I may like personally as a human or as an anthropologist, or I may not like, or whatever. And I don't know if we have the right, this is an answer to a question that we may get to later, whether we have the vocabulary to talk about this stuff. But from an anthropological point of view. But like part of me is just sort of like, I'm going to look at how social democracy works. And when looking at design, one of the things that struck out was that like, despite all of these changes, in design, a lot of stuff has remained the same. And so it's a discipline that is rife with certain kinds of social democratic registers, certain kinds of political registers. And despite all sorts of changes over, you know, almost a century, there's been a lot of stability there. And that sort of became an interesting query for me, is what is this what's making this stability happen when I would expect there to be more change in the way that people talked about it that would align with changes in politics. So yeah. And
how would you explain that stability?
I think partly it has to go with partly looking at social democracy from kind of like sort of what Daena was saying and others have been saying, that like there are technocratic, there are bureaucratic changes that have happened, some of which are extremely drastic in Swedish governance, and the sort of provisioning of welfare from the state. But the kind of cultural, psychological, essentially affective, humanistic side of social democracy is pretty strong, to the point where it's actually really like I apologize for just sort of speaking in anecdotes in some ways, but I think that they're illustrative for me anyway. I remember this moment where I was going back to the US, and after being in Sweden, and I was like, oh, there's going to be a period where I don't have any health insurance for a month before my health insurance kicks in. And my Swedish friend was like, even though Swedes know that our health insurance is bad over here, they were still like, really? It was like he was worried that I would be for a month scared to actually, the issue was I had to move furniture, and I was like, I don't want to move my furniture because what if I break my leg, right? It was this moment where it was like, even though on one level he sort of understood, sort of meeting someone like me who actually was scared to sort of do a thing because of health insurance reasons was just sort of like strange to him, right? And it makes sense. And that to me, there's an embedded assumption about the way the world should work in people who grow up in different kinds of societies, and that idea that like a basic level of your body is going to be okay is just something that we don't have as Americans, but you know, Swedes, not that they don't worry about their bodies, I'm sure you all worry about your bodies, but you know, in this particular healthcare way. So I think that there's something, I mean, like I'm coming back to the word, and I know that it's not fashionable, but there's something cultural that's really something that has stuck with me. Now, when it comes to the design stuff, I think that's part of it, is that like there's an element of, you know, I wouldn't make an argument that like everything is designed to be social democratic, but that like when you do a lot of work, when there's a really long-standing, explicit project to tie a particular register of politics to the everyday world that people experience, then it's, you know, that discourse is doing a lot of work to sort of get the psychopolitics of the average ordinary people to kind of understand the world in particular ways. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm agnostic about, but I think that has happened.
I think, I mean, Keith, I think that it's hard to escape. It's, you know, it's hard not to talk with these kinds of anecdotes, because I think any American that goes and spends any amount of time in Scandinavia has these kinds of, I mean, they're almost little bits of culture shock. I'll never forget, you know, when I first moved to Norway and someone just could casually, you know, and of course I don't save any money. And I said, like, what do you mean you don't save any money? And he said, what would I save money for? You know? Now I think increasingly, for example, in Oslo's very expensive housing market, maybe you save money for your dwelling, but that was the kind of thing that when I was, you know, 22, 23 years old, it like blew my mind apart. You know, how could you not, you know, orient, you know, all of your thinking when it comes to the money you earn towards, you know, saving some part of it to retire with, to pay for medical expenses. So I think that you're right. I mean, there's this dimension that feels, and the word, you know, is obviously problematic for various reasons, cultural. My tendency is to see that, you know, the kind of cultural forms that we are encountering on the ground is flowing directly from a very distinctive institutional architecture that characterizes the welfare system, that even if it isn't social democratic, has for so long been kind of, has moved towards that active utopia, to use Zygmunt Bauman's term, of social democracy. It was the kind of destination towards which this was supposed to move for a period of time, and maybe there's some inertia there. Go ahead, Daena.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to add to this conversation about the stability, right? What keeps this kind of idea or imagined community, if I could use those terms, going. And I think we have to remember that the relationship between state and capital is always mediated by the idea of a nation, right? So the relationship between state and capital is always
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you know what? Today was the day that my computer picked to announce that it's no longer going to recognize my charger. So, so it just went down. I don't know if I'll drop out again, but I certainly hope not. We'll do our best to kind of. I think it's going. So Daena, sorry, go ahead about my untimely exit. Like I said, you know, there's a little bit of magic that goes into making any Zoom-based session work, and unfortunately, the magic ran out.
Well, so, I thought what I said just shocked you. No, actually, this gave me a chance to go back on what I forgot to say. I think there's definitely what Andrea Milback might call an afterlife to the notion of welfare, right? And afterlife or some kind of this, utopia. I think Kelly, you used the word utopia, right? So when I started doing field work in Finland in 2006, the country had just come out of a really bad economic recession, and it hit Finland a lot worse than it did in Norway or Sweden and in Denmark. And people talked about it in terms of national shame or national embarrassment. And the kind of economic policies that were put in and is now called this kind of new economy, people had to justify like, oh, we have to put this in, but after this, things will be better. Mm-hmm. So there is this kind of a deferral of this utopic moment where everything will be going back to normal. So even with this shift, and it has started, you know, just like Keith said, things have changed on a very intimate level, but there's still this kind of a hope or deferral of that social democratic moment that will come. So the justification for implementing certain neoliberal or whatever economic policies are very different from, let's say, a liberal democratic state.
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, also, if we look at the climate question in Norway, for example, I think that, you know, the partiality of the labor movement, a great segment, you know, a large segment of the labor movement to the perpetuation of the oil and gas sector is an interesting reflection of the ways in which sometimes the social democratic project isn't necessarily put on hold, but doesn't necessarily join up with the most progressive forces in society. Other thoughts on this question?
Well, I just want to continue on the anecdote thing, because I was reminded when you were talking about the difference between the US and the Nordic or Scandinavia. I was reminded, I was part of a workshop in Copenhagen, and there were some Americans in this workshop, and when we went out in the evening, there was a demonstration for paying taxes, and they couldn't sort of get their head around for paying taxes. It must have been against. You mean against? No, for paying taxes. And I think that says something about the sort of Nordic countries, I guess. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, someone had said in the beginning, and it might have even been you, Renita, you know, just this, there's this remarkable, you know, one of the questions that I haven't asked, which I sent to you, is what is the welfare state anthropologically speaking? And I think one of the answers to that question would be something like it's a massive system for the perpetuation of a sense of intergenerational or kind of indebtedness, and this sense of this deep-seated sense of indebtedness that tracks with you over your life that is going to give you a very different feeling when you're paying your taxes, for example. While we're on anecdotes, I mean, I once remember talking to a bureaucrat in Norway who was more conservative politically. And he bemoaned the fact that Norwegians who get their vacation money, their feriepenger, every year, were under the mistaken impression that that came directly from the government, that it was a gift from the government. And he said, "This is your money. They shouldn't feel like they owe the government anything. They should, this is theirs. They should really feel, they're earning this. They should feel proud of themselves. This has nothing to do with the state. And yet the state is kind of like laundering it and cultivating that sense of indebtedness." That only kind of perpetuates, I guess, what we've called the project or something else. Halvard, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, very interesting comments, I think, and what you said just now is something that reminds me of the question of culture as anthropologists have traditionally understood it. There are aspects of the Scandinavian or Nordic world that are really interesting in comparative terms, and you have hinted at some of them. The question of continuity, for instance, is interesting. And if I understood you correctly, Daena, about the Finnish state, I think, and the kind of optimism or the sense that the state is something that you can trust, for instance, is based on very relatively stable traditions, not characterized, for instance, by the European classical experience of revolution, predatory states, and enormous rapid bloody changes. So the lack of those aspects have established some very interesting aspects of political morality, ideas of utopia, optimism, trust. And I always wanted to talk more about people who are not from Scandinavia, who look at this in terms of the naivety of Scandinavian people trusting the states, etc. But I think it has to do with some very interesting and relatively deep cultural historical traits, some of which go back to the effects of the establishment of the Protestant Church in the 1500s, which is perhaps the most incredible institutional unification of Europe ever, in the same sense that Napoleon created one system for all through his wars that happened in Scandinavia, to the effect that the institutional infrastructure and value system became incredibly uniform without becoming authoritarian simply. So that you have this very strange paradox between a strong individualism and a collectivism, which is not the kind of the primitive family-based collectivism, but something completely different. And you have the same kind of thing, I think, relationship between the idea of political community and nationalism, because it seems that many of the Scandinavian political movements and some of the political movements are very nationalist, but when you look closer, I think they are more than most people tend to think, more very strong social ideological manifestation of very efficient popular political alliances than they are ideological fundamentalist movements. And so you have other effects that may be more direct effects or emergent properties of the welfare state. Like, for instance, you mentioned the idea of the summer money, the sense that, for instance, young people are not particularly afraid of the future, in the sense that they're not deeply concerned about how to finance their education if they're interested in having or taking an education, because they are basically, most people, or some, until very recently, the majority have had reason to think that the future is not that in danger. For me personally, I will be kind of secure regardless. And that kind of phenomenon has cultural implications in terms of, for instance, autonomy, intergenerational solidarity, and things of that sort.
For sure. You know, Halvard, I want to just hone in on one thing that you said, which was about the kind of the deep-seated, you know, I guess we could call them cultural roots of this value orientation. Because I think in different ways, our work speaks to almost the idea that value orientation isn't deeply rooted, that you need to use things like design or social policy or labor market policy to constantly cultivate it. And I think that there's some strong empirical evidence to suggest that, you know, it isn't so deeply rooted. I mean, if you know Bo Rothstein's work on quality of governments and institutions, I mean, he and some others have looked at, for example, this really fascinating phenomenon where Poles in Poland don't trust the state, but Poles in Norway do tend to trust the state. And so there seems to be some relationship between, you know, the being there, not as an anthropologist, maybe even as a kind of quasi-anthropologist, you know, when you move to a place, in the sense of trust. You know, I've always been struck in studying migrants in Norway that there is this broad tendency to, you know, to try to or want to do as the Romans do or do as the Norwegians do. You know, I'll never forget, you know, interviewing this young Portuguese guy that had lost his job. And he said, you know, if they had this sick leave system in Portugal, they destroy it overnight. And I said, well, you're Portuguese and you're not trying to destroy it. And he goes, well, that's not really what you do here. And so I've always been really interested in where does that come from? How does one kind of fix in their mind a conception of Norwegian or Swedish culture or ways of doing things? And then how do they attempt to kind of act in concert or, you know, comport themselves in a certain way that conforms to that and to a kind of a broader sense of what would be sustainable with respect to the welfare system. Before I open it up to our audience, the last question I wanted to ask is, where do you think this is all going? I mean, for all of you that look at welfare in different ways or some aspect of the contemporary Nordics, what do you see as the most significant trends? I mentioned a couple in a question to you all that you could comment on if you want, or identify others. Those were digitization, climate change, migration. But what are the new kind of frontiers in the anthropology of Nordic welfare, you think?
Well, I'm not sure I would say the new frontier, but my new project will be about algorithm-based decision-making in the Swedish social services. And I think this, the use of algorithms to make decision in governance is, or in government is kind of scary and interesting. I think
I'm
this
with
is
you.
something that, sorry, yeah, I think we need to study this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the shrinking of the welfare state to something that can fit within the screen of a smartphone, for example, or the Twitterification of welfare claiming. I've talked to people that talk about character limits on forms where you're supposed to explain the complexity of the problems that you have and try and appeal to a bureaucrat that may or may not actually be a person. I think that this is kind of very much a brave new world. What do others think? Go ahead, Keith.
I agree. I mean, I think that it's been a part of it. Like, I remember when I was thinking about what my next project in Sweden was going to be 10 years ago, I had some friends who were working on design friends who were working on like a system for having elderly folks get their information from local and federal government through the television. And so which I think is abandoned at this point, but this sort of the technology, the digitalization or the technologification of welfare provision, but also just kind of like the state, I think is even with cashless stuff, and I mean, there's just a way of if we think of money as one of the ultimate public goods, then, or cash as one of the ultimate public goods, and to sort of get rid of that, or to really diminish its standing in a publicly oriented governance structure is interesting. And I think there's stuff like that over and over that you're seeing happen. And I think that in some ways, the questions that we've been sort of talking about where, in some ways, where has the anthropology of Norden been, those questions are going to be sort of still there, but like applied to these very different kinds of changes that we're seeing in a whole bunch of aspects of society.
Absolutely. I mean, I read it as, the next step in kind of utopian thinking, much of it kind of urged on by organizations like the OECD, who, when they conduct their audit of the kind of this brave new world of the digitized welfare state, only seem to list the benefits. It'll only be more efficient. It'll only be more accessible and inclusive. And there's, I think, a lot that is elided, most obviously the issue of the digital divide, but also the implications of, for example, completely dispensing with that bureaucratic encounter where you're actually encountering another human being face to face. It's going to be a lot harder or a lot different, I think, to appeal to the algorithm. Daena, what do you think? Where's this all going? Or what are the big issues ahead?
I think the Nordic states as a region allows for real re-theorizations on gift exchange and rethinking of economy more in terms of its etymology in oikonomia as an administration. So how is it that we administer over individuals? What is the interface between the collective and the individual? And maybe, Kelly, you were also saying, how is it that we can act, for the common good, even at our own, even at our own risk? Why is it that people would want to act for the common good? So we might even start talking about what is a community, what is it to be in common, what is the commons, something that maybe we in the US should be talking about as well. Like what is public property, for instance. Besides that, I think we can also learn from Scandinavia, the life of institutions as it manifests as traces within individual subjective experience.
Definitely. I mean, I love all of that. I think that you're on some really critical stuff. And I think if no one has written what, the full chem as oikos, I think that needs to be written, because I think that there is this way in which, at least traditionally, these societies have been conceived of almost along the lines of like a household. It's to be administered in a certain kind of way, for the reasons of, I guess, integrating a kind of diverse public into a kind of single, community of kinship or something like that. And Halvard, finally, what do you think?
Sorry.
I
just wanted to jump in and say that I agree on the gift exchange things. I just wrote a piece that was sort of riffing on formgivning as a form giving as a kind of gift exchange, thinking about design and the formgivare as a someone who gives form to the world, but using a Mosian kind of framework. And I think that inspired by my work in Sweden. So I think that there is something really interesting there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also speaks, to Renita, your interest in, algorithmic governance. I mean, and Halvard, you may have been the one that pointed this out, or for, where I kind of got this idea initially was the significance of, local forms of contact and this entwinement of the bureaucratic apparatus with communities, and the presence of people that you're familiar with, that you circulate with in everyday life as the people that are on the other side of that desk. I mean, how do we endanger the forms of indebtedness that are constitutive of this kind of Nordic trust if the gift giver is entirely, anonymous, faceless, computerized, digitized? So Halvard, trends, where do you see this all going? And then we're going to open it up to the group.
Well, I'll try to be short, but I think these are very, very good, ideas. And I agree completely that we should really go back and explore the gift-giving logic of these societies, because I think we can really find something there. And also the symbol of oikos is a wonderful comment to what I'm struggling with now, because I sometimes, because I work with try to conceptualize the really long trends in European democracy from the old Athenian democracy to the Scandinavian welfare states. And for instance, if we follow Walter Scheidl's The Great Leveler and Thomas Piketty, we can really see that these are examples of of locally embedded democracies. And there are not so many others. There are a few, but most of them were eliminated at some point in history. But these examples of European democratic experiments are really, really interesting. And one thing they do have in common is that the fact that the institutions upon which they were built were mainly local. And that's very often overlooked in the study of Scandinavian societies. The welfare state is much less centralized, or it used to be, than most people tend to think. Municipalities and local institutions have been really politically strong, not very efficiently governed, relatively autonomous, and incredibly important in developing the ideas that become the welfare state. So that this is really a local phenomenon among the only democracies we know that for a long time were controlled basically from below, which is a strange thing to realize, I think. Maybe I'm exaggerating now, but I think this phase in human history has been interesting, to put it that way. So we should try to learn from it. And I would very much like to go back to, as you said, Daena, the gift-giving logic. I myself, for instance, I went back to Gibson and Silander's anarchic societies and look at the kind of logic of hunter-gathering societies and look at what kinds of egalitarian relationships that made possible autonomy and also other aspects that are vital to any democracy, like, for instance, solidarity that is not simply ideological, but based on real individual interests.
Absolutely. So I think that that's a really wonderful collection of reflections, I think, on, where much of this is going. And, part of the reason that we wanted to convene, to bring all of you together was to generate, this kind of thinking and hopefully identify some of the threads around which we can all continue to kind of converse and collaborate. I now want to open it up to our audience. I have a comment saying that the venerable Ulf Hannertz has something he'd like to say. So Ulf, if you can unmute yourself. Let's see if I can ask to unmute you. I think you're still muted, Ulf.
Now, do you hear me?
Now we hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. No, I guess it's really my role here not to identify new frontiers, but to sort of point to some old frontiers, sort of, and going kind of 50 years back in time when I think anthropology was beginning to receive a kind of public recognition it did have a great deal to do, of course, with the fact that there was transnational migration, mostly labor migration. But I think when, as I remember it, when institutions of the government, called us up to ask if we could help, it was sort of the welfare state that asked us to, see how cultural diversity could somehow be combined with the welfare state. And I remember, for instance, two of the early ethnographies that were done in Sweden at about this time. I mean, one was about the schools in a suburb of Stockholm where there were lots of Turkish migrants, and the other was in the same neighborhood, how the Turkish migrants could be integrated into Swedish healthcare. So that was in both cases very much a matter of sort of bringing these newcomers into the welfare state, and at the same time, respecting their cultural diversity, certain freedom of choice, rather than sort of assuming that assimilation necessarily had to be the end result. So I think that was, one important part of social anthropology, certainly in Sweden, I think probably generally in Scandinavia half a century ago. But then I would also want to remind you that at about the same time, there was one sort of tendency to look to the underside of the strong state. And the main figure here, I think, was our good Norwegian colleague Ottar Brox, who of course was not only an anthropologist, but sort of a rather transdisciplinary person, moving between anthropology, sociology, economics, and of course he was at that time based in Bergen with the department of Frederick Barth. So there was certainly a strong anthropological input. But Ottar Brox's famous book in this period was in Norwegian, it was What Happens in Northern Norway. When that was translated into Swedish, you'd have to leave Norway out of the title, of course. So it became the Central Bureaucrats and the Backlands or something like that. And so here you had a concern with the way that the strong state, the welfare state, was sort of managed from the center, from Oslo, from Stockholm, rather than taking into account these strong local sentiments and local interests that I think also Halvard just referred to. And I'm not sure, I mean, okay, so the concern with migration, of course, has changed, I think, in some unfortunate ways over the years. I'm not sure that the theme of, looking at internal migration and the decline of rural communities in our countries is as strong now as it was half a century ago.
Well, certainly. I mean, the kind of tension between, at least in Norway, the districts and I guess the metropole still remains very much alive. And correct me if I'm wrong, my Norwegian colleagues, but you might have a Senterpartiet prime minister. It's not out of the realm of possibility from this kind of agrarian party that's really built a great deal of support in recent years by championing the non-integration of municipalities. And I think maintaining that devolution of power. Ulf, the first thing you talked about, these immigrant communities and their relationships with the welfare state, I seem to recall from your work, you're referring to this as cultural welfare. In this ways in which there is an attempt to integrate people into this system almost on their own terms. I've always been struck, however, going back to what we were talking about with respect to, trust and the kind of ethos and the kind of affective attachments that people build with the system, there is this way in which there is a commitment to kind of the maintenance of an aesthetic difference when it comes to incorporating migrants. And at the same time, they're radically assimilated into this way of life that I think, Keith, you captured with respect to the healthcare system that I was talking about. I mean, I think of another anecdote. I was once interviewing a young Pakistani woman who talked about the fact that she was struck by the fact, her family came from Pakistan. And when she lost her job, if she lost her job in Pakistan, the obvious thing to do would be to become reliant materially on her family again. And that would engender a certain kind of indebtedness. And maybe later in life, she'd feel a stronger obligation to care for her parents. But in coming to Norway, she and her siblings, when they lost their jobs or needed to pay for school or something like that, they didn't turn to their parents, they turned to the state. And her sense already was behind, for lack of a better term, this kind of aesthetic difference, that they were being assimilated into a way of relating to the state and of relating to their family that was radically different. And that raises questions of, what is the parent-child relationship? What is the individual-state relationship in these different contexts? And what is being preserved, and what forms of relatedness and obligation are unacceptable within the parameters of this system? Did anyone else want to respond to Ulf before we go back to our audience? All right, I saw Thomas, you next.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, since, and thanks for convening this, Kelly, it's been great. And I mean, since Ulf mentioned migration, and others have spoken about sort of the universal, as it were, inclusive character of the welfare state, I think it needs to be pointed out that welfare states are membership organizations with criteria for membership. So they do include, and they also exclude. And what you're pointing out, Kelly, is quite interesting in the sense that there is a general shift between the first and the second generation. It's not unambiguous, it's not simple, but on the whole, there's a shift, which some of us have written about as a shift in, you might say, a predominant notion of personhood, from a particular form of personhood to a different form of personhood. We don't have to go into the details as to how we label them, but quite clearly what you say about this umbilical cord that connects individuals with the state, replacing the extended family is very significant and has ramifications in many directions. But then again, I mean, okay, undocumented migrants, they're not members, Roma gypsies, not members of the welfare state, and therefore not considered welcome. And seriously, I mean, if you think about the trade unions, the trade union movement, the labor movement, which has been so important in securing rights for people who were disenfranchised and powerless and poor and so on for a century, didn't do much for unemployed people. I mean, they haven't really prioritized, as it were, because they have their obligations towards their members who are employed. Because if you're unemployed, you don't join the trade union. So we must keep this in mind, that it includes, but it also excludes. And since the term community was also mentioned, the imagined community of the welfare state, it's also, I mean, it has some fuzzy frontiers. It doesn't have clear boundaries, which I think is also important to explore.
Absolutely. Do any of our participants want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I completely agree that it's, I mean, the nation state is definitely, or the welfare state is a membership organization, and it's also in the Swedish case, and I mean, you're so connected and so visible to the state by your personnummer, for example, that it's really easy to exclude and include. It's really, I mean, an undocumented migrant is you can't become a member if you don't get the personnummer. And if you don't get the personnummer, there are so many things you can't do. So it's yeah.
Absolutely. There's this kind of, selectively making legible in these contexts. Halvard, I also saw your hand.
Yeah, well, thank you for these very interesting comments from Ulf and Thomas. But as to Thomas' comment, I agree completely that this is a very important thing to point out. And I think the labor market and the unions are very important examples and anthropological interesting to investigate in order to see the implications and the struggles that go on here. In one sense, one could expect that the solidarity developed in the welfare state in Scandinavia would dispose or will inspire a culture which would be sympathetic to basic income schemes because of the unemployment problems. But as Thomas pointed out, the unions are really against basic income schemes, and very well, their interests are not always something that serves unemployed people, as you, Kelly, knows very well from your studies. And of course, it's kind of obvious that the labor unions wants to insist on the power of labor unions, which in turn depend on their power in the market, so that employment policies in Scandinavia are incredibly ambivalent, and they tend to split the major popular movements in two, which is a critical problem nowadays when there's just not labor markets that are able to incorporate people and make that.
Yeah, I had the chance to talk to Jim Ferguson one time about the similarities between South Africa and Norway and the prospects for both of those societies to move towards this distributivism. And my sense is, I think your sense, Halvard, which is these societies which seem most open to and most embracing of redistribution are radically productivist. And I think that you'd find more resistance to distributivism or new distributivist politics than most people would think. Go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to say that on a, like, I think there's a parallel in various what would be called culture industries, or as you were saying before, Kelly, about the sort of aesthetics of how citizens relate to governments. In a literal sense, I've always seen various design worlds or design industries in Sweden, and I think this is probably true across the Nordic countries, to the degree that they are symbolically related to all sorts of social democratic stuff. They're really machines for including and excluding people in various ways, right? So that, like, whether it's sort of fashion, like clothing fashion, or interior decorating or whatever, right? Migrant Swedes, immigrant Swedes, or other foreigners who come to the US, to Sweden in particular, there's a pressure to aesthetically align or disalign with these particular aesthetic regimes that does a lot of work for people to sort of project in everyday life who they belong to, right? And this is like what groups they belong to, insider, outsider, things like that, right? And it's not so stark as insider, outsider, but it's not that either, right? That's always something that's really interesting to me, and the degree to which designers themselves, a lot of the folks that I worked with doing field work were not Swedish Swedes, but sort of the degree to which to be successful in Sweden, in the Swedish design world, is to recapitulate particular forms of Swedish design. That was very, very strong, and I think that just works all the way down. Absolutely.
I think that you're very much onto something there. And I think, while we don't have time to explore today, Keith, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, the ergonomics of social policy, because I think that there's also this tendency to think in terms of formal characteristics, and to perpetuate an ergonomics that very much forces one to conform to a particular understanding of comfort and well-being. But so I see 3 more questions. We're running out of time. We might go a little long. If anyone needs to leave at any point, please just do what I did before and just disconnect suddenly and without explanation. So I see, we'll go Stefan, Gard, and then Stephanie. So we'll try to make it quick so we can get these all in. So go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks for a very stimulating conversation. I don't think anybody really said that. I really enjoyed listening in. I think I'm more speaking here as a native voice, not as an expert on this, but so I'm kind of curious about some of the other perspectives you might have on 2 things I've thought about. Firstly, I mean, it's interesting to me how anthropologists always return to Marcel Mauss at the end of the day. The gift is always popping up somewhere. And I can certainly see that it's a relevant way to think if you look at the history of the recent history of the Danish welfare state, where there was a clear reconceptualization of the state in the 2000s, away from idea of welfare as something sharing to welfare as a contract between state and citizen. And it was especially articulated through a concept called the competition state, which I guess is an international concept, but was very popular and made popular by Danish political scientists. So that's sort of my question to you. Firstly, is this something that you also see in Sweden, Finland, Norway, this idea of the competition state, new public management state? That's something that's been popping up and been a form of new legitimacy of the state. The other thing is just an observation on I think Thomas said Norway as, or sorry, the state as a membership organization. And in a way, I think it's even more that, and you can in a way see it in the way that COVID-19 restrictions have been handled by the state. I mean, it's not a police state that's really going out and, you know, strictly regulating, telling everyone you have to do this. And to some extent it is, but not completely. It's also very much nudging, giving suggestions. And it has a complete audacity in what the state think it can do. In familiar terms of going in to give suggestions for very, very private affairs, such as in the Danish Board of Health, actually suggesting how you can have sexual relationships and dating during the crisis and doing it in a COVID-19 safe way. So it's really interesting how it's so familiar and yet not really sort of, not being as strong, I mean, strong in surveillance terms or in, you know, control terms, but strong in nudging, strong in sort of getting under your skin. So it's just a thought and observation, and thank you again for this really stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Stefan. Wonderful points. Responses from our panel. You know, Renita, I'm tempted to kick it right over to you, given, you know, lean and new public management. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how the Danish how it is in Denmark, but my sense is that Denmark is a little bit more competition oriented than Sweden. But of course, I mean, this is only on a minor degree. But I haven't heard the concept of the competition state in the Swedish context, for example. Yeah, the COVID-19, well, I mean, Sweden has this, we have our own version of dealing with COVID-19. But yeah, there are also instructions on dating and who you should sort of, I don't know.
Yeah, you know, the reason I thought of you immediately, Renita, is because of your interest in, I mean, you know, evaluation and standards. I mean, in my work on the unemployed, I mean, I look at the, you know, interventions that are not, you know, too dissimilar from the ones that Daena looks at, but, you know, the using of like score charts that track how many applications people send out, you know, constant evaluating the competition, not only between people that are participating in these courses, you know, to outdo one another and send more applications, but also the competition between the instructors of these courses on contingent contracts who don't know if they're going to be renewed. And so they have to everyone is jockeying to kind of run up their point totals because no one actually knows what the effects of these courses are on making people more employable. It's just as much activity as you can engage in as possible. Halvard, I saw your hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the competition state. I think that expresses very nicely what is going on throughout Scandinavia and has done so for a while. Although the competition state as an expression is not much used in Norway either, but it's, in my eyes, a very, very typical development in the whole of Europe and in welfare policies in the EU, for instance. It has represented a further development of what originated with Tony Giddens and Anthony Blair's idea of the third way. And sometimes it's called the investment states, but it's all, as you, Stefan, emphasized, based on the idea of the contract. But I find it interesting anthropologically that there are still important tendencies in all the Nordic countries, I guess, that are really pointing in the opposite direction. So it's not only a competition state. There are other aspects that really undermines the complete victory of the competition logic, which I find very interesting because that seems to be perhaps more strongly and solidly embedded than many other places in Europe. So I would like to explore that further, that dynamic.
For sure. I'm going to go now to Gard and then Stephanie. And like I said, just try to make it as quick as possible.
Yes, hello. So actually my question relates to, or thank you for the seminar, first of all. My question relates to what Halvard just talked about actually with the, this conditional welfare state and the third way. So I did the fieldwork in 4 municipalities in Norway with some public service organizations. And there this one sentence Halvard wrote in a book about how some politicians in Skien at one point, they saw welfare policies as relative to budget restraints. And I was wondering if you have some reflections on that in regards to the future, because you see in the welfare state in general that you have more people who need welfare and sort of less money to spend. So I'm wondering if that's going to result maybe in some way more increased conditionality for welfare services, or if it's going, if they have to kind of reduce the amount of welfare possibilities available for the citizens. So that's my question.
Great question. Halvard, if you want to take it, and then if anyone else wants to respond.
Well, just to be very short, thank you for the question. I think that's a very important observation. I think that's the way it's about to turn, more conditionality. And then, as Titmuss famously said for a very long time ago, services for the poor are poor services. So conditionality is detrimental to the broad support for the welfare state as such. On the other hand, or the opposite, universalism makes for broad alliances. So it's a kind of a self-reinforcing phenomenon in the welfare state, reinforcing the support for the welfare state. And that, as Gösta Esping Andersen brilliantly pointed out in 1991, those are the deep, important explanations for the emergence of the welfare state in the first place. And I think that's incredibly important, because if it depends on broad political alliances, we know much about how that can be done. So it's not a lost case, I think.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I mean, budgets they'll remain higher than they otherwise would if these societies continue to adhere to universalism as kind of a design principle of policy. If there are no other pressing thoughts, then I'm going to go to Stephanie. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thanks, Kelly. And thanks to everybody else. Like others have said, this is a really fascinating discussion. I'm a PhD student in the United States, and my research is focused on well-being economies, specifically in Scotland and Wales, but Iceland is part of the same group of countries that have made this formal commitment to a focus on well-being governance as a way to complement or have an alternative to such a prominent state focus on GDP. So I'd like to ask the panel if you're familiar with the concept of a well-being economy, and if so, how you think it relates to this concept of welfare. I'm sort of wondering if this idea of a well-being economy might be a way to try and revitalize the idea of welfare in places where maybe it's become politically untenable to sort of use that specific framing.
Excellent question. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Any responses from our panel? You know, I'll say, I think at once, just in response to your question, I mean, I haven't heard much discussion of, you know, well-being society in the Norwegian context, but a couple of years ago, there was a social scientist, Kåre Hagen, who very much straddles this kind of scholarly policy line. And he talked about the development of what he called the welfare barometer, which I think he did create, which was kind of an annual means of measuring quantitatively certain welfare outcomes. And I was very curious to know what would happen if you can almost come up with like a GDP-like way of measuring, you know, multidimensionally welfare outcomes, how that would actually influence policymaking, how people think about their own welfare. You know, Stefan Kumlin, who I believe is a political scientist or a sociologist, you know, has talked about the kind of limited number of indicators that human beings have at their disposal to actually make sense of big phenomena. You know, for the economy, we look at, you know, the stock market in the United States, or we look at the unemployment rate. These are the things that help us make sense of these big abstract trends. And to my knowledge, you know, you don't have, I mean, the unemployment rate might be one, but once again, those are more economically oriented. To my knowledge, there aren't mainstream social scientific indicators that people point to when it comes to thinking about their own well-being, but maybe, you know, as we move towards the quantification and audit of everything, maybe that's where we'll be going. Go ahead, Daena.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I think what you pointed out, Stephanie, is really important in that hyvinvointi, well-being or welfare in Finland is really intimately tied to one's capacity to labor, and that is to give to the society. So the welfare services you will be getting or allowed to get or you can apply for is definitely tied to how your labor capacity. And as Kelly, you mentioned, there are so many parameters, indexes, all these projects that aim to render visible your labor capacity or labor perfectibility, that you can't separate the two, labor from welfare.
Absolutely. Now we're actually past time. So if you need to leave, please depart. I know that Helena has a comment. So we'll give you the final word.
Okay, thank you very much. A great discussion and very interesting comments. I think somebody mentioned COVID, and I think COVID has accentuated the fact that we need this Nordic perspective, since our countries are dealing in very different ways with this. And also the borders are between a number of our countries are closed. So COVID has changed the relationship between our countries in quite suddenly and in a rather dramatic way. So I think, again, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that we need to look at all of the Nordic countries and not just one, because we are different. The Nordic countries are different. They're not all the same.
For sure. And I think that's one of the objectives of the series is to not only look for those similarities and areas of overlap, but to work towards that disaggregation. And COVID is a wonderful example because it's one of the first times I think that Sweden is not the model for how the rest of the industrial or post-industrial world should be. So I guess you've taken a hit on your brand.
Yeah, but the thing is, in Sweden, we really like that we are not doing the same kind of thing that everyone else is doing. So that's also kind of funny, I think.
It's probably the closest that Sweden and Texas have come in terms of a policy response to a particular issue. So thank you to Helena, thank you to all of our audience members, and thank you to our panelists for being here. This was a wonderful discussion, and I certainly hope that we have the opportunity to continue it moving forward. For those of you that are still here, I want to invite you back in almost a month from now for our next roundtable called Environments. It's going to be on March 19th at 3 p.m. GMT. So please rejoin us for that conversation. And, spoiler alert, I think that there's already some interest in the possibility of building at least some kind of informal network based on all the folks that are interested in these things, and perhaps even continuing this as a series in the future. So I hope that you'll continue to join us, continue to participate in the conversation. And with that, wherever you are, whatever time it is, have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.